On the morning of December 18, 1944, the world seemed frozen. Not just the snow that covered the Belgian countryside but time itself. On a narrow bridge over the Warch River, a 19-year-old boy stood alone, staring at a massive steel monster. It was a King Tiger tank, 70 tons of death, its cannon as long as a telephone pole, its armor so thick that it laughed at shells. The boy had nothing but a bazooka and the stubbornness that only a farm boy could have. This boy was Francis Curry. He wasn't a soldier of legend yet. He wasn't a commando or a trained fighter. He was small, quiet, and unassuming, with eyes that had learned to read danger from endless mornings on a farm in Indiana. He had been an orphan, bounced from home to home, never truly belonging anywhere. By the age of 12, he had learned a hard truth. Life didn't care about fairness and nobody was coming to save you. Francis grew up pitching hay, fixing fences, and driving tractors in the cold Midwestern sun. Every chore was a lesson in patience, in problem-solving, in doing what had to be done no matter how impossible it seemed. On the farm, you didn't get help when a fence broke or when a storm threatened your crops. You fixed it yourself or you failed. That grit would follow him across the ocean and into a war that promised to destroy everything he knew. When Francis first tried to join the army, he was laughed at. The recruiters said he was too small, too weak. "The rifle weighs more than you," one officer told him. But Francis didn't quit. He went home, trained himself, and returned at 18, finally meeting the minimum requirements. Even then, his superiors didn't expect much. A skinny farm boy wasn't someone who could stand against the forces of the Third Reich. Yet, Francis didn't see himself as a hero. He saw himself as a man who had no choice but to keep moving forward. By July 1944, Francis was in Europe. The battlefield was nothing like the farms he had known, yet he recognized the same patterns. Danger hidden in the shadows, the need to adapt, the importance of careful observation. He watched his fellow soldiers, learning, waiting for his chance. He didn't boast. He didn't seek glory. He simply worked, quietly, always ready. Now, he stood on the frozen bridge in the Ardennes forest, a place the Americans called the Ghost Front. It was supposed to be a quiet sector, a place for resting units and training new soldiers. But winter had turned it into a trap. The snow was deep, the trees silent, and the fog thick. Everything seemed still, but Francis could feel it in his bones. The storm was coming, and it was unlike anything he had faced before. A few days earlier, Hitler had launched a desperate plan. The Eastern Front was collapsing, and he had thrown his last men into the Ardennes forest. Elite SS units, boys taken from schools, old men pressed into service, and 1,000 tanks, all moving in silence under the cover of heavy fog. The Allies believed the Ardennes impassable in winter. They thought the forest was safe. They were wrong. Francis checked his equipment. A bazooka, a few rifles, and the worn uniform that hung loosely on his thin frame. His platoon, Company K of the 120th Infantry, had been sent to guard the bridge. It seemed routine at first until whispers came of German tanks moving through the fog. No one believed them. Until Francis saw the shadow first, a massive shape moving through the trees. He remembered the lessons from the farm. Observe. Calculate. Fear was useless. Panic would get you killed. On a farm, when a wolf was at the door, you didn't run. You grabbed your tool, whatever it was, and you fought. That instinct had saved him countless times before, and it would save him today. The forest seemed to hold its breath. The snow sparkled under the pale winter sun, concealing the danger beneath. Francis crouched, his eyes scanning, his hands gripping the bazooka like it was an extension of himself. The sound of distant engines reached him first, a low vibration that made the ground under his boots tremble. He wasn't the only one listening. Across the river, the King Tiger was advancing, its tracks crushing trees and ice alike. The odds were impossible. One boy against the apex predator of the battlefield. One boy against elite soldiers who had trained for years to kill. Yet Francis Curry had no choice. He could run and die or he could stand and fight. The bridge, the river, the road behind it, everything depended on what he would do next. As the fog rolled closer, Francis took a deep breath, feeling the cold bite through his uniform. He could almost hear the wind whispering through the trees, carrying the sound of death closer with every second. The quiet boy from Indiana was about to step into a war that the world would remember, not for its generals or tanks, but for the courage of a single orphan with a bazooka in his hands. In that moment, time slowed. The snow, the trees, the fog, the massive tank looming over him, they all became part of the challenge. Francis Curry, the farm boy, the orphan, the underestimated soldier, was about to prove that even the smallest hands can change the course of history. The morning fog hung thick over the Ardennes forest, turning the world into a gray blur. Francis Curry moved quietly with his platoon, Company K of the 120th Infantry, toward Malmedy. Each step on the frozen ground was careful, measured. The forest seemed peaceful, almost inviting, but Francis had learned long ago that silence was the deadliest sound of all. On the farm, a quiet morning could hide a storm. Here, the quiet hid something far worse: German tanks and soldiers moving like ghosts in the mist. The Americans called this place the Ghost Front. Units sent here were either resting, recovering, or learning the ropes. It was supposed to be safe. But Francis knew better. He had seen the reports. Hitler was desperate, and desperate men made dangerous plans. The Ardennes was not impassable, it was a trap waiting to be sprung. As they approached Malmedy, the platoon noticed the first signs of enemy movement. Tracks in the snow, faint at first, then deeper, fresher, more frequent. Trees broken, branches bent. Something heavy had moved through. Francis crouched, squinting through the fog. He felt the same tingle he had felt on the farm when the birds stopped singing. Danger was near. The town ahead looked small and harmless. Houses lined narrow streets, chimneys puffing thin trails of smoke into the gray sky. But Francis knew better than to trust appearances. Every building, every corner, every frozen ditch could hide death. The Germans were coming, and they were not coming quietly. That night, the roar began. It started as a low rumble, barely audible over the wind, then grew into a thunderous roar that shook the ground. Over 1,600 artillery guns fired simultaneously, shells ripping through the Ardennes like a tidal wave. Trees exploded into splinters. Buildings shook. The silence of the Ghost Front ended in fire and smoke. Francis's unit took cover where they could. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and scattered. The Germans had moved with precision, striking first at weak points, cutting off roads, isolating units. Panic rippled through the platoon. Men shouted orders, rifles cracked, and the air smelled of smoke and fear. Yet Francis remained calm. He checked his men, whispering instructions. He didn't have to be loud. His presence alone steadied them. He thought of the farm. When a fence broke in the middle of winter, you fixed it. When the cows escaped, you ran after them, freezing hands and all. Survival depended on action, not fear. Now he applied the same principle to the battlefield. Observation, calculation, patience. Every step mattered. Every decision could mean life or death. Through the fog, shadows moved, tanks, half-tracks, and infantry. German units advanced with deadly coordination. They were veterans, well-trained and ruthless. They had no mercy. Francis knew that once they reached Malmedy, the town, the bridge, and everyone in between would face annihilation. He crouched behind a low wall near the bridge, inspecting his position. The bazooka lay beside him, the weapon awkward and heavy in his hands. The rifles were ready, magazines full. He counted the men in his squad, small, weary, frightened. They looked to him, unknowingly placing their lives in the hands of a boy who had once fixed tractors for a living. And yet, Francis did not hesitate. He moved with purpose, checking angles, spotting obstacles, planning paths of fire. In his mind, the battlefield became a map, every building a potential advantage. The Germans thought they were advancing against a weak, inexperienced force. They were about to be very wrong. The forest around them was deceptive. Snow muffled footsteps, fog obscured movements, and the silence made it impossible to tell how many enemies approached. Francis felt the tension in his chest, the cold biting into his bones, yet his mind was sharp. Every sound, every shadow, every vibration through the frozen ground mattered. The king tigers were coming, and they were monsters, unstoppable except by cunning, luck, and courage. He remembered the stories from the older soldiers, about tanks destroying villages, entire platoons wiped out in minutes. He felt the weight of the responsibility, not as a soldier of rank, but as a man who had no choice. If the bridge fell, the German forces could sweep through, cutting off supply lines, endangering thousands of lives. Every second mattered. Night fell. The fog thickened. Francis and his men dug in as best they could. The ground was frozen, solid as rock, and the wind cut through their coats like knives. But the worst part was the anticipation. Every distant rumble could be the enemy. Every movement in the fog could be the last sight he would ever see. He tightened his grip on the bazooka and whispered a silent promise. He would not let the bridge fall. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time was meaningless in the cold, in the fog, under the shadow of tanks. Then in the distance, a massive shape emerged through the mist. A King Tiger tank. Its tracks crushed snow, its barrel pointed like death incarnate. Behind it, smaller Panzer tanks and German infantry moved in tight formation. They didn't know Francis was there. They didn't know that one boy, underestimated, small and seemingly powerless, was preparing to face them. Francis's heart beat fast, but his mind was calm. He thought of the farm, of the lessons learned in silence, of the stubbornness it had taught him. The world had always underestimated him. Today the Germans would too. The odds were impossible, the danger immense, but he had no choice. He would fight. The ghost front held its breath. The fog hung thick over the frozen streets of Malmedy, turning everything into gray shadows. Francis Curry crouched behind the low stone wall near the bridge. His breath rose in short clouds, freezing almost as soon as it left his lungs. The air smelled of smoke and cold, the distant rumble of engines vibrating through the frozen ground. He could feel it in his bones. The German advance was near. Then he saw it. The lead King Tiger emerged from the mist, its massive tracks crushing snow and debris, its long 88mm barrel swinging slowly, methodically, searching for a target. It was more than a tank, it was a fortress, a 70-ton death machine, the apex predator of the battlefield. Most men would have frozen. Most would have run. But Francis didn't have that choice. He had a bridge to protect. Lives depended on him. He looked at his squad. They were small, scared, shivering in the cold. Their rifles were ready, but against a King Tiger they might as well have been slingshots. The Germans thought they had the advantage. They assumed the Americans would retreat, would surrender, would scatter like leaves in the snow. But they hadn't met Francis Curry. The boy from Indiana reached for his bazooka, the weapon awkward and heavy in his hands. He had fired it in training, yes, but never like this, never against a living monster with a crew inside aiming to kill. He loaded the rocket carefully, his fingers numb, trembling from cold and fear alike. One misfire, one mistake, and he could be gone. The tank's turret began to swing toward the building where his men were hiding. Francis held his breath. His mind raced. On the farm he had faced storms, predators, impossible chores. Each time he had adapted, survived, solved the problem. Now the problem was a steel monster with a cannon that could vaporize anything in seconds. He fired. The rocket screamed out of the tube, slicing through the fog. Francis dropped to the ground, curling into the snow. A metallic clang rang out. The rocket hit the turret ring but did not penetrate. It did something else though. It blinded the crew, shattered optics, threw the German soldiers into chaos. The King Tiger spun, firing blindly, the shot smashing into the wall above Francis's head. The force knocked him down, burying him in bricks and frozen snow. Pain shot through him. His ears rang. Dust and smoke filled his lungs. Most men would have stayed down. Most would have given up. Francis pulled himself together. On the farm, quitting wasn't an option. You either fixed the problem or it killed the cows, or yourself. He looked around. His men were still alive, still hiding, still depending on him. He had no choice but to fight. He crawled to the nearest half-track, abandoned in the morning retreat. Inside was a crate of rockets, untouched. He grabbed it, splintered wood cutting his hands, loaded another rocket and peered over the edge of the half-track. 3 Panzer IV tanks had rolled around the corner, supporting infantry moving house to house. The Germans assumed they were facing an entire platoon. They didn't know it was just one boy. Francis aimed at the lead panzer. He tapped the side of the bazooka, hoping the circuit would fire in the freezing air. 1, 2, 3 seconds of pure silence and then, whoosh, the rocket hit the tracks of the lead panzer. Steel tore apart. The tank lurched sideways, crashing into a ditch, immobilized. 2 others stopped, confused, searching for the source of fire. Francis was invisible, moving like a shadow through smoke, debris, and snow. The German infantry began to advance, unaware of the boy's presence. Francis dropped the bazooka and ran through the open street to a fallen soldier. There lay a Browning automatic rifle, heavy and lethal. He grabbed it, rested the bipod on a frozen rock, and opened fire. The bar roared. Controlled bursts, short and precise, took down soldiers rushing the factory. To the Germans it looked like a coordinated defense of many men. They didn't know the terrifying truth. It was just one boy. The battle became a deadly dance. Francis switched between weapons, moving like a ghost. Bazooka, rifle, grenades, machine gun. Each weapon used with precision, each movement saving lives. The Germans were baffled. Rockets seemed to come from everywhere. Machine gun fire came from all directions. They could not understand how one person could hold an entire town. Hours passed. The cold bit deep. Francis's hands were bleeding, his lungs burning, his muscles screaming for rest. Every shot, every movement, every decision mattered. The Germans adapted, trying to find him, but the farm boy's instincts were unmatched. He knew the layout of the town, the angles, the weak spots. He moved like water, filling every gap the enemy left, making himself impossible to hit. At one point, a German officer spotted him. The King Tiger's cannon swiveled, a shell screaming toward the factory. Francis dove behind rubble, the blast throwing snow and bricks into the air. He rose, checked his weapons, and continued the fight. There was no room for fear. Only action. Only survival. Only victory. By mid-morning, the German advance had stalled. Tanks were destroyed, infantry pinned, reinforcements trapped. The boy who had been underestimated, laughed at, and overlooked had become a one-man army. One farm boy against the might of the German war machine. And yet, he knew this was just the beginning. More tanks, more soldiers, more danger loomed. But Francis didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The bridge, the town, the lives depending on him, they demanded everything he had. And Francis Curry, the orphan farm boy, had plenty of grit left. The morning fog had turned to smoke. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and burning fuel. Francis Curry lay low in the ruined factory, the cold biting through his uniform. His hands were raw, his face streaked with dirt and blood, but he was alive. And for now he had a plan. The German infantry had regrouped, their confidence shaken by the boy who seemed to appear and disappear like a ghost. They moved cautiously now, searching for the hidden defenders, convinced a whole platoon lay in wait. They didn't know it was just one farm boy, barely 19, fighting for his life in the bridge. Francis crawled to the back of the half-track, dragging his frozen fingers across the splintered wood. Inside was a crate of anti-tank grenades and a few remaining bazooka rockets. He checked them carefully, knowing one misstep could end his life. The weapons were heavy, unstable in the cold, yet they were his only chance. He looked out at the street. 3 Panzer IVs were advancing slowly, flanking the factory, while infantry moved between buildings. Francis remembered the lessons from the farm. The foxes, the wolves, the storms that tested his patience and cunning. You never fight the animal head-on. You use the terrain, the traps, the surprise. That was his advantage here. He pulled a grenade from the crate, its weight familiar in his hand. He had modified it slightly, a risky move that could backfire, but he knew he had no other choice. He timed his throw perfectly, waiting until 4 German soldiers were clustered near a corner. He hurled it and the explosion threw them off their feet. Smoke and debris filled the air. Shouts rang out. Chaos. Fear. Francis smiled briefly. Just a moment and then back to work. The Panzer IVs were relentless, but they were not invincible. The first had been damaged earlier by his bazooka rocket, immobilized in a ditch. Francis picked the lead tank of the remaining 2. He moved silently, crawling through snow and debris, approaching the road that gave him a clear shot at its tracks. One well-aimed rocket, one perfect strike, and it would be done. He aimed. The rocket screamed from the tube, spiraling toward the tank. The explosion tore the track apart. The Panzer lurched sideways, its momentum throwing snow and steel into the air. The last tank hesitated, confused, unsure where the attack was coming from. Francis dropped behind the half-track, catching his breath, counting his limited rounds. He had no more than a handful left. Every shot was precious. Every misfire could be fatal. Then came the infantry. German soldiers were moving faster now, desperate to take the factory and crush the invisible threat. Francis switched to his Browning automatic rifle. Its heavy weight pressed against his shoulder, but it roared like a thunderstorm. He fired controlled bursts, picking off soldiers moving too quickly, forcing the others to take cover. To the enemy, it seemed as though a coordinated team defended the street. They had no idea it was just one boy. Minutes passed like hours. The snow turned red in places, the fog thickened with smoke. Francis ran, ducked, fired, crawled, and threw grenades with precision born from years of farm work, throwing rocks at crows, shoveling hay, fixing fences under pressure. Each action was instinctive, each decision life or death. He spotted a German officer trying to coordinate the attack. Francis crawled closer, heart pounding, hands numb from cold. He fired a single round from the bar. The officer dropped and the German formation faltered. Confusion spread like wildfire. Without leadership, the soldiers froze. The boy who should have been terrified now held the advantage. A sudden roar split the air. The King Tiger was moving again. Its turret swiveled, searching, firing blindly. A shell smashed into the factory wall near Francis, showering him with bricks. He dove into a corner, coughing, snow and dust in his mouth. Pain shot through his legs, but he refused to give up. He remembered the farm. You kept going no matter what. That was how survival worked. Francis grabbed another grenade, another chance. He waited until the German infantry crowded near the wrecked Panzer IV. With perfect timing he threw it. The explosion sent soldiers flying, igniting fuel from the destroyed tank. Flames roared, smoke billowed, and the Germans fell back in terror. For a moment, silence. Only the crackle of fire and distant engine roars filled the street. Francis looked around. His men inside the factory were still alive. The bridge was still in American hands. The Germans were disoriented, confused, terrified. One boy had turned a desperate defense into a battlefield nightmare for the enemy. But he wasn't done. The day was far from over, and more reinforcements were surely coming. Francis checked his weapons, counted his ammo, and prepared for the next wave. Each movement was deliberate. Each breath measured. He knew the Germans were learning, adapting, becoming more dangerous. But he also knew something they didn't. He had the mind of a farmer, the instinct of a survivor, and the heart of someone who had nothing left to lose. The factory, the street, the bridge, it was all part of his land now, and he would defend it. Not for medals. Not for glory. For survival. For the men who depended on him. For the innocent lives that could be lost if he failed. Francis Curry, orphan farm boy, had become a one-man army. He had faced impossible odds and survived. And as he readied himself for the next attack, he knew this was only the beginning. The fog swirled, the tanks lurched, and the German soldiers regrouped. But one thing was certain. The boy from Indiana had changed the game. He was no longer just a soldier. He was a ghost in the snow, a nightmare for the enemy, and the last line between death and survival at the bridge of Malmedy. The sun barely pierced the foggy morning as Francis Curry pressed his back against the shattered wall of the factory. Snow mixed with smoke, the smell of burning metal and gunpowder stinging his nose. He was exhausted. His hands bled, his lungs burned, and every muscle screamed to stop. But the enemy wasn't finished, and neither was he. Through the haze he spotted movement, German soldiers regrouping, more determined than before. They had realized one boy had destroyed their tanks and held their infantry at bay. Now they wanted revenge. The officer they had lost shouted orders, rallying the troops, trying to push Francis from the factory, to crush the bridge, and erase the ghost that had humiliated them. Francis checked his weapons. Bazooka, empty. Browning, half a magazine left. Grenades, only 2. Every choice mattered. One misstep and he would die here, alone in the snow. He had no reinforcements. No artillery. No air support. Just him, the farm boy who had never known anything but hard work and survival. The first Panzer IV, immobilized earlier, still blocked the road, burning. But from behind it, the Germans brought up a new weapon, flamethrowers. Their thick hoses hissed as men advanced, ready to turn the factory into an inferno. Francis knew that fire meant instant death. He couldn't let them get close. Not the men inside. Not the bridge. Not himself. He grabbed the last grenade and aimed carefully. Timing was everything. He waited until 4 German soldiers crowded near the corner, unsuspecting, then hurled it. The explosion was deafening, the force throwing snow and debris into the air. The enemy screamed and scattered. Francis ducked behind rubble, breathing hard. The flamethrowers were now stalled, the soldiers uncertain, their morale shattered by this invisible, unstoppable foe. But there was no time to celebrate. Through the smoke, he saw the lead officer moving cautiously, trying to organize another attack. Francis's heart pounded. He couldn't risk waiting for them to gain control. He crawled forward, his frozen limbs aching, dragging himself closer. One shot from his bar and the officer went down. Chaos erupted among the Germans. Soldiers shouted, tripped over debris and fired wildly into the smoke. Francis crawled back, checking his remaining ammunition. Only 8 rounds were left. 8 bullets to face an entire regiment. The enemy had learned to fear him, but that fear would not save him. They were methodical, relentless, trained killers. They would not quit. Not until the bridge and maybe him was destroyed. Then he saw it, reinforcements. A half-track, mounted with a .50 caliber machine gun, creeping through the smoke. It could tear through the factory walls, mow down anyone inside. His heart sank, but he had learned one thing in life. You don't give up when the odds are against you. On the farm, when the tractor broke, you fixed it. When the wolf came, you faced it. Now he faced the monster machine. Francis sprinted toward it, bullets pinging around him, snow kicking up in clouds. He reached the vehicle, climbed onto the side, and grabbed the .50 calories. The massive gun roared under his hands, shaking him with every shot. He aimed carefully at the lead enemy vehicle, the one threatening the bridge. Sparks flew as he fired, hitting the metal and engine components. The half-track lurched and skidded into a ditch. The crew panicked, jumping out into the snow. For a moment he allowed himself to breathe. The Germans hesitated, their coordination shattered, their assault faltering. But Francis knew this was only temporary. The enemy would regroup. They had numbers, weapons, and determination. He had skill, cunning, and a stubborn refusal to die. For now that was enough. Through the haze he saw his squad inside the factory, peeking through broken windows. Their eyes were wide, faces pale. They had survived because of him, and he felt a rush of quiet pride. Not for glory. Not for medals. Just for keeping them alive. He ducked back into the shadows, checking his ammo. 8 rounds. 1 grenade. Barely enough to survive the next assault. The ground trembled under approaching tracks. Tanks. Another wave, heavier than before, emerging from the fog like monsters. Francis gritted his teeth, every nerve screaming, every instinct honed on farms and battlefields ready to act. He had no choice. He could retreat and die later, or he could fight here now and maybe save the bridge, maybe survive. He loaded his last grenade into the bazooka, careful, precise, hands trembling from cold and exhaustion. He took a deep breath. On the farm, when everything seemed impossible, you acted anyway. That's what he would do. He would act. And he would survive if he could. The German infantry surged, tanks moving into position. Francis's fingers gripped the bazooka tightly. He raised it slowly, aimed at the lead panzer and squeezed the trigger. The rocket screamed into the morning fog, spinning, twisting, striking its target. The explosion tore the tank apart, sending metal and fire into the snow. 2 more tanks behind it faltered, unsure what had happened. The infantry paused, fear and confusion spreading like wildfire. For the first time that day, Francis allowed himself to stand. Exhausted, wounded, and frozen, he looked across the street, across the smoke and chaos. The bridge was still intact. His squad was alive. The German advance was halted. Against all odds he had survived another wave. But the day was far from over. Francis Curry, the farm boy from Indiana, had danced on the edge of death. He had stared into the abyss and refused to fall. But he knew more challenges awaited. Tanks, guns, flamethrowers, and men, all still alive, all still dangerous. One boy against an army. Impossible, yes. But Francis had learned one thing. Impossible didn't exist on the farm. And as he caught his breath, listening to the distant groan of engines and the frantic shouts of soldiers, he realized that surviving the edge of death was only the beginning. The battle for Malmedy, and for his life, was far from over. The snow had stopped falling, but the world was far from calm. Smoke hung low over Malmedy, curling around the ruined buildings like ghostly fingers. Francis Curry crouched behind the shattered wall of the factory, shivering not from cold but from exhaustion. His body ached from hours of running, firing, and dodging. His hands were raw and his fingers felt like blocks of ice. But he was alive. And the bridge still stood. Through the haze the enemy regrouped. German tanks rumbled like thunder in the distance, their turrets scanning for movement. Soldiers crept between buildings, flamethrowers ready, weapons primed, eyes burning with the desire for revenge. They had learned fear, but now they had numbers, strategy, and determination. And Francis had nothing left but courage, skill, and sheer grit. He checked his weapons carefully. Bazooka, empty. Bar jammed in the cold. Grenades, only one left. Every second, every decision was life or death. The farm boy from Indiana had been tested beyond anything imaginable. Yet, for all his exhaustion, Francis's mind was sharp. On the farm, survival meant thinking ahead, finding the weak point, striking when the moment was right. And now that lesson would save him again. The first wave of tanks arrived, moving cautiously down the narrow streets, cautious after the chaos Francis had caused. Behind them, infantry advanced slowly, trying to pin down the unseen American. They didn't know he was one boy, one farm-trained fighter, a ghost in the snow. They didn't know he had been here all day, anticipating every movement, reading every shadow, calculating every step. Francis crawled forward, using the rubble for cover. His squad inside the factory had survived, barely, thanks to his relentless defense. They peeked through broken windows, eyes wide with fear and awe. He nodded at them. "Stay down," he whispered, barely audible. "I've got this." He spotted a German officer trying to coordinate the tanks and infantry. This was the moment. Francis's hand tightened around his last grenade. He remembered every throw from the farm, every rock he had hurled at crows, every tool he had lifted to fix fences or drive cattle. Precision, timing, courage, that was what had kept him alive all day. With a deep breath, he hurled the grenade toward the officer. The explosion threw snow and debris into the air, sending the German soldiers sprawling. Panic rippled through their ranks. Tanks faltered. Soldiers froze. Francis moved quickly, crawling to the side of the street where the lead Panzer IV had stalled hours before. The German tanks were relentless, but their confidence wavered. Francis knew their fear, their hesitation was his advantage. He reached the immobilized tank and spotted a gap in its armor from earlier damage. Without hesitation, he aimed the bazooka's last rocket. One shot, one chance. The rocket screamed, spinning through the fog, striking its target. The tank erupted into flames, metal twisting, fire roaring, a wall of heat and smoke erupting into the sky. The other tanks paused, unsure. The infantry, leaderless, began to scatter, firing blindly, tripping over rubble and retreating. For a moment, silence fell over the street. Francis lay in the snow, heart pounding, body trembling. He had done it. The bridge was safe. His men were alive. The enemy advance had been halted. But the cost was visible. Francis's uniform was shredded, his hands bloody, his body frozen and aching. The adrenaline that had carried him for hours was fading, leaving him weak and vulnerable. Yet he forced himself to move, crawling toward the remaining Germans who were trying to flee. One last shot from his rifle, aimed carefully, sent them running. Chaos reigned, but the day belonged to him. Francis looked around at the destruction. The wrecked tanks, the smoking buildings, the frozen snow stained with battle. He had faced impossible odds, fought against an army, and survived. The farm boy who had been underestimated, laughed at, and nearly rejected by the army had become the last line of defense at Malmedy. Then he heard it, the distant sound of Allied reinforcements. Trucks, jeeps, and the roar of tanks moving toward the town. The German soldiers who had survived began to retreat, realizing they could not win against this invisible force backed by fresh troops. Francis allowed himself to breathe. For the first time in hours he felt relief. Inside the factory his squad emerged slowly, shaking, exhausted, alive. They had survived because of him. They approached, offering words of thanks, but Francis waved them off. Medals, glory, and praise were not what mattered. The bridge was intact. His men were safe. That was enough. As the snow began to fall again, soft and quiet this time, Francis sat on the cold ground, staring at the horizon. The world seemed to hold its breath. He had survived the impossible, fought with courage and wit, and held the line when it seemed hopeless. The farm boy from Indiana had become a legend in his own right, a symbol of grit, determination, and courage under fire. And though his body was battered and his spirit weary, Francis Curry knew one thing. He had done what was needed. Not for glory, not for recognition, but because survival, courage, and duty demanded it. The bridge, the factory, and the lives of his men had been saved. Against all odds, one boy had faced an army and lived. The day ended with the quiet snow covering the scars of battle. The Germans were gone, the tanks destroyed, the infantry defeated. Francis looked toward the forest, thinking of the farm he had grown up on, the lessons it had taught him, and the stubborn determination that had carried him through hell. He was tired. He was cold. But he was alive. And that, in the chaos of war, was victory. The snow had settled over Malmedy, soft and quiet, covering the scars of battle. The fires had burned out, the smoke slowly drifting into the cold sky. Francis Curry sat on the frozen ground, chest heaving, hands numb, body battered and bruised. Around him, the wreckage of German tanks and destroyed weapons told the story of the impossible day he had survived. One boy against an army, and he had held the line. His squad emerged cautiously from the factory, their faces pale, eyes wide with awe and disbelief. They had survived because of him. The farm boy from Indiana, the one everyone had underestimated, had become their shield, their guardian, their hero. They approached him, helping him to his feet, wrapping blankets around his shivering frame. Words failed them. What could anyone say to a boy who had faced death so many times, yet refused to fall? Francis looked at the bridge he had defended, the river beneath flowing quietly, unaware of the horrors that had raged above. It was intact. His mission was complete. The Americans could hold this vital point. Thousands of lives were saved, and he had done it alone. Not because he sought glory, but because it was the right thing to do. Because that was what survival demanded. Days later, Francis was transported to England for recovery. The doctors were shocked he had survived at all. Severe frostbite, concussion, shrapnel wounds, exhaustion. His body had been pushed beyond limits no one thought possible. He lay in a hospital bed, wrapped in blankets, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the machines. He was alive. That alone felt like a miracle. The news of his bravery traveled fast. Reports came from Malmedy, soldiers recounting the legend of the lone boy who had stopped tanks, held back the SS infantry and saved the bridge. Newspapers wrote about the Indiana farm boy who defied the German army. Yet Francis did not read them. He did not seek fame. Fame had no place in the snow, in the mud, in the fear of battle. Survival did. Duty did. The lives of his comrades did. In July 1945, a ceremony was held in Germany. Francis, still thin, still small, stood in formation with other soldiers, his uniform hanging loosely on his frame. He looked fragile, almost like a ghost among men who had been hardened by war. Yet the medal in the hands of Major General Leland Hobbs would tell a story no uniform could show. Sergeant Francis Curry, the general's voice boomed over the loudspeakers, echoing through the stadium filled with thousands of soldiers. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty at the risk of your life, you have demonstrated courage, skill, and determination that are a model for all Americans. Francis stepped forward as the Medal of Honor was placed around his neck. The crowd erupted, cheering, applauding, astonished by what a single underestimated boy had accomplished. Yet Francis did not smile. He thought of the ditch, the cold, the fear, the snow. He thought of the men he had saved. Glory, medals, and recognition were not what mattered. Duty had been done. That was enough. After the war, Francis returned home to New York. He did not go on speaking tours. He did not seek to relive the glory of Malmedy. He worked quietly as a counselor for the Veterans Administration, helping men who had survived battles, who carried nightmares and scars, both visible and invisible. He listened. He guided. He cared. Few knew that the quiet man behind the desk was the boy who had faced a small army and lived. Few knew that the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from the Battle of the Bulge was in their midst. In his spare time he gardened. He fixed fences. He grew tomatoes. He lived simply, quietly, like the farm boy he had always been. The lessons of the orphanage and the Indiana farm had never left him. Work hard, help others, face what comes without fear. And though he had survived one of the deadliest days of the war, he never considered himself a hero. Heroes were loud, flashy, immortal. Francis had learned that true courage was quiet, stubborn, and human. He passed away in 2019 at the age of 94. When he was buried with full military honors, his tombstone bore only his name and rank. It did not list the tanks he destroyed, the men he saved, or the battles he had fought. Because Francis Curry's story was never about recognition. It was about duty, courage, and the quiet strength of an ordinary boy in extraordinary circumstances. And yet his legend lived on. In letters, in stories, in history books, and now in videos like this one, the tale of the orphan farm boy who defied impossible odds continues to inspire. Francis Curry showed the world that courage is not measured by size, by strength, or by firepower, but by the refusal to accept defeat, the will to keep moving forward, and the determination to protect what matters most. The bridge at Malmedy, the snow-covered streets, the frozen ditches, and the echoes of battle remain in memory, silent witnesses to one boy's incredible bravery. Francis Curry's story is a reminder that history is written not only by generals and kings, but by the quiet, determined, ordinary people who stand when everyone else would fall. And in that silence, in the cold snow, in the memories of those who lived because of him, Francis Curry's courage will never be forgotten.